Hello and welcome to a new installment of the third Age Babylon 5 podcast. This is our second part of our discussion on the long Twilight struggle, the big gut punch episode of Season 2, where the Narn-Centauri conflict comes to an end and we meet Dral for the second time in the show, and he forges the big alliance of light that Babylon 5 and Sheridan are going to be a part of. This week around you can see it's only Layla and me. Micah can't join us, and this is a good thing for once because we can now talk a little bit also about the maybe spoilery implications of this episode, at least a little bit, which we usually don't do. But as usual, beforehand, let's go a little bit into first impressions, if you have any. I know it's been a little while since you've watched this episode last.
Yeah, it really has been a little while. But also, in general, I have to say that this episode does not leave the strongest impressions on me. So there are definitely episodes to come that have a lot more... have a much stronger effect on me, definitely. So this is just still for me we are still in this ordinary place of Babylon 5. We still see conflicts and wars and attacks that we know from our daily life that happen around us. So there's no big reveal and no big gut punch for me yet, because this is just daily life on Earth.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting because I think definitely Babylon 5 goes into a few more unusual places that are removed from what we have in the real world, and yeah, maybe this does feel a little bit more familiar, even though it is, in universe quite an extraordinary event. I mean, this is kind of a conflict that has been brewing for the first two seasons, coming to a fairly definitive conclusion, at least for now. Micah had two things that really stood out to me in terms of her first reaction. That didn't have anything to do with the big war. They were mostly revolving around Dral and his return with the Great Machine. Maybe we should talk about this briefly first, because I think this is the part that we will have the least things to talk about, at least in my experience. For one, Micah was not a big fan of the very theatrical performance of our new Dral. I quite like him, especially in his interactions with Sheridan, because he's so cheeky about it. But do you have any inkling?
No, not yet. I also didn't have much to say to that, and really just didn't leave an impression as well.
There's not many impressions for you from this episode. This is unusual, but it's interesting. The one line of his that she really liked was his calling for Zathras, and not because it's a reference to Zathras from our Babylon 4 adventures, but just because she liked the implication of him having annoying little helpers that don't show up when he wants it. So there's kind of the contrast of him being this very powerful being now integrated into this planet-wide machine, and even so he still gets annoyed because people don't show up. And yeah, I quite like the fact that this left such an impression on her, even so she didn't connect the dots here yet, which was quite fun. And it just reminded me that the Great Machine and the time travel and the whole Shadow War aren't really connected yet from the show's perspective. I think this is just one big ball of things that I have in my head having seen the show. But yeah, for Micah, these are all us still fairly disconnected little islands of story beats that will at some point, develop into something and maybe come together. Obviously, we see a little bit of this by the very end of this episode when we get the Alliance of Light and Sheridan's little speech there. But I'm assuming this also didn't leave much of an impression on you yet.
No, definitely not.
Interesting. So this whole conspiracy plot thing, not your jam.
No.
Okay, so we have basically just one big thing that happens in this episode. Kind of everything revolves around the fact that we get to see the Centauri fleet bombarding Narn for days on end, and everything is either leading up to this or the aftermath, and we see this from the Narn perspective, from the Centauri perspective, from the human perspective, and kind of everyone else. And one of the first things that I talked about with Micah about was just looking at all of this and saying, well, this is great, this episode is covering a lot, but she would have really liked to have seen also the perspective of the various aides of the ambassadors, because as it is, from each civilization or species, we get like one point of view. We get to see how Jakar reacts to the fall of his homeworld, but not how Natoth does it. We get to see how Dylan deals with all of this, and Sharon deals with all of this, but not much about Linear. We get to see, obviously, Lundo's perspective on Centauri Prime, but Vir is nowhere to be found. And I have found that is actually kind of an interesting thought, especially because usually the aids are kind of the alternative perspective from each species, and it would have been interesting to see how they dealt with that, because I imagine, for example, Natoth would have had a very different reaction to what Jakar had.
Do you think so?
I think so, because Jakar has this entire thing where the planet is getting bombarded, and his first reaction is, I need to go home and I need to fight, I need to join the resistance, and he gets talked down from that. He gets talked into, seeking sanctuary. And then I think about Natoth, who, sees Deathwalker for the first time, somebody who she personally doesn't even have a blood feud with, but, several generations removed, and even this is enough to send her in kind of this blind rage of attacking Deathwalker immediately. So I can't imagine that Natoth would stay on Babylon 5 for this. I think it's very probable that if she wasn't already joining up with the resistance, we haven't seen her for a while, this is the time now where she definitely goes home and fights.
I never thought about that, to be honest.
Me neither. This is really something that Micah came up with when we were talking about this episode, and no, it just struck me as an interesting line of thought, just getting even more perspectives on this. If this had been a big two-parter, we could have gotten a lot more into the personal character stuff.
A side that I would like to approach this from is the only side which I would actually have to say something to at this point is Sheridan.
Okay, so from the human side.
From the human side, yes, or from the side of the bystander, just watches how everything happens, because I think we really see something switch in Sheridan here, because earlier in this season we were a bit surprised by how strict he was towards Jakar, and how strict and authoritarian almost he handled his behavior. And we just saw that now we had a commander on the station that had never really understood the situation the Narn culture was in. While with Sinclair, we always had a commander who already had made us experiences with their situation, and here we didn't have that, so we could kind of, I think, always understand from what kind of point of view Sheridan was acting. But we as the viewers of the show, if we had watched the first season already, had another perspective, because we had gotten to know the brutality of the regime of the Centauri, actually. And I think here we have a switch, because here in the end, we have this conversation between Sheridan and Jakar, where you realize that Sheridan now understood. I think that was a very strong moment for me, where you saw that now things made new sense to him, and he could actually pledge a new kind of now I'm lacking the word. Support, yes, but stronger than that.
Allegiance?
No. But something like that. I'm sorry, I'm lacking the word even in German right now. Could promise a new level of that to Jakar, because now he understood his reaction and why the culture that he was coming from was so bloody and so different, because now he could see really in what kind of situation it was born.
Yeah.
And I think that is a big transition, and that probably also is a transition that in each of the characters we have, we really kind of sum up the function a place like Babylon 5 could have, when you start to understand these, because I still think that Sharon still would deal with a lot of situations very different than Jakar does, and still would not agree with all he says and does, but still understands where he comes from, which I think is the most important transition that you have when you have different cultures meet in such a place.
Yeah, I mean, from the way you describe it here, I wonder, it doesn't seem like we're at the point where Sinclair, now I'm getting confused, we're not at the point where Sheridan would say, all right, everything that Jakar has ever done is completely justified and fine, but I think he is at the point of recognizing the advice that I gave, when the Centauri Emperor came here, and I just basically told Jakar, swallow your pride and deal with it, and, maybe if you think about it really, really hard, you have a chance to make peace here. That doesn't really make sense anymore. This isn't a cycle of violence that just anybody has to break by, swallowing their pride and taking a hit. No, if the Narn decide to take a hit, they're just wiped out from the universe. And this is just not an option the way that maybe Sheridan imagined it to be. And I think it's interesting that you bring up Sinclair here. Obviously, he is our go-to comparison. But when I was discussing this episode with Mike, one quote came to my mind, and instinctively I thought, oh, that's probably something the commander of the station would say. It's the warning that Jakar receives that, we humans know what happens when an invading force starts leaving all planets by the wayside and goes straight for the homeworld. That's, when the Battle of the Line happens. And I think of this as something that probably Sinclair would have said to Jakar very early on. But in this instance, it's Franklin doing this. And I think that makes a lot of sense because Franklin and Sinclair are both characters who have seen sort of the worst of the Earth-Minbari War. They've seen what it feels like to have this invading force knocking on your door and basically your own species facing extinction. With Sheridan, obviously, he doesn't fall into the trap of, oh my god, we could have won the war. But he is kind of the one war hero that Earth Alliance has. He is the guy who managed to get a victory against the Minbari. That's what we've learned about his backstory the most of here. So I think it makes sense that it took him the longest to kind of get to exactly the lesson that you described, that this is a new dimension of conflict that we're facing here.
Yeah, I never saw it that way. I never really thought it would have such a strong personal reason for him to just take this long. I just think that he really liked this experience, which he now has. Seeing this kind of firsthand and witnessing this, which is also a thing that you kind of have to be open for, because you could also be in that situation and you could be in Sheridan's place and still kind of blame the Narn for being the victim, which happens often enough when these attacks happen in real life. So it's still what I just want to say is that it also still shows us that Sheridan is an own and special kind of character, because not everyone could have made this connection, could have taken this step towards Jakar.
No, absolutely. And I think that is one of the reasons that Jakar is willing to take his hand in this final conversation they have, because he recognizes that this is still something that a lot of humans would not do. I mean, a lot of humans would kind of have the same outlook on this as we saw the bartender have towards the end of the markup. Oh, they all died from a plague, or they all got bombed into oblivion. Well, I guess they must have been just stupid about it. The Narn got enslaved. Well, they just didn't like freedom enough. That's like one of the basic colonial narratives that you can have in this situation, as you describe it, as the bystander species in the humans.
Would have behaved better. Maybe the Centauri would have just left.
Yeah, just concede a few of the border territories to them. It's easy. It's then it's going to be enough. And I mean, we get to this specific rhetoric by the end of the episode. We have this entire idea like, oh yeah, the Centauri have taken over the Narn homeworld. Surely the war is over now. That's the promise. Lord Reefer said then there's everything dealt with and it's going to be fine. Oh wonder, now they decided they need some buffer zones in their immediate neighborhood and declared war on yet a few more people. Who could have seen that coming? Like even Londo himself, who I would argue isn't making the best decisions and having the best foresight recently, absolutely recognizes that, yeah, of course that's what's going to happen. Like this is immediately going to escalate even further. But definitely this sentiment still remains.
Yeah, so maybe we should also talk about what it means actually for Narn that the war now is over. Because, at the moment we have all of these voices, for example, just demanding that Ukraine should stand down so that we have peace in Europe again. And if you demand that in any kind of war where someone has been attacked openly, you have to think about what does it mean for a group of population if they just stand down, if they just stop defending themselves, or if they lose, like the Narn, they have definitely lost. They were militarily overpowered in this situation. And if we look at the demand of the Centauri, we get a taste of what this peace means. Actually, peace in this situation just means that the Centauri could overpower the Narn and they just cannot fight back right now anymore. But the fighting actually does not stop, and the brutality actually does not stop.
No, the contrary.
On the contrary, it's just not called a war anymore. That's the only difference. We don't call it a war anymore. We are now completely invading this world, but it's basically still the same situation and has still the same brutality. What I find the most interesting here actually is that the Centauri want to have trials against Narn on Narn, or no, it doesn't say on Narn, but they definitely want to have these trials without any international supervision.
Yes.
So any kind of attempt of forming like an international community, what we are, or an intergalactic community, which birth we are kind of slowly witnessing here in the show, they want to exclude, which actually always bears the question of what do you want to do if you definitely want to exclude that? Like, what does that mean?
I mean, this is something that we talked about with Micah also briefly. It's so fascinating that, especially in season 2 now, everything we've learned about the Centauri is, it's about appearances. You know, Londo is talking about his masks, even in season 1 to Adira. And, they have this entire sword fighting deal and such. They always want to keep up appearances. Even just from the Centauri perspective, not having observers there makes them look bad, just like you mentioned, like, what are you planning to do if you can't have, international observers there? But that really doesn't matter at this point anymore. The mask has kind of fallen off, and that goes even to the point, you mentioned you have to think about what happens when the war is over and we're getting into the occupation phase. You don't use mask drivers on a planet if you really plan to do anything with this planet anymore. Like, the entire method by which this victory is achieved turns the Narn homeworld into a colony that's never going to turn a profit. There's no way that, even if you enslave all the Narn as a working population, there's so little of them left and so much rebuilding to do. This doesn't make sense on any kind of level where, I guess they just wanted to take the territory and everybody's under new management now. The only way this makes sense is, they just want bloody revenge. They want to punish the Narn and commit genocide in 12 different ways if possible, but that's about it. And so the whole idea of just appease this, I think, comes from a much more old-fashioned understanding of what wars are about, where it's just like, all of this is just a big game for resources and territory. So, you take some, you lose some, but in the end, that's going to be fine.
Yes, it just comes from this idea that all the wars are born from reasonable, understandable interests that one state has, like territory, like resources. But there are definitely wars, and it's a hypothesis I can't prove within here right now. But I would actually have a thesis that, at least in the modern world, wars are often more complex and more messy, and there are goals that we should not really recognize as goals, such as putting an end to a certain culture, to a certain language, for example, and that can be the goal of wars. It has been in the past. It is at this moment right now. In our time, so yeah, he sees it in the other demands of the Centauri that Londo actually has to present. For example, one dead Centauri should be punished with 500 dead Narn, which is which is in general is no. I just mean that, especially with a culture that is so built on blood revenge, this is an interesting measure to take, because it definitely shows that the Centauri want to escalate it even further. Because if you calculate that, the blood revenge can basically never end. It becomes exponential at this point. They just want chaos. And they make that public. Everybody knows that. Everybody can calculate that too and see the chaos. And they just are in the situation that they can at this point afford to do that.
Oh, it's that, and you also know exactly what this argument would look like if you were to point this out in this meeting. Well, that's for the Centauri just one line. Yeah, well, if the Narn have this barbaric ritual of blood revenge, that's their own fault. It just shows they're not a civilized people, and so obviously, what are we supposed to do about that? I think it just makes a clear statement. Either this is going to lead to complete chaos, or we just have to erase the Narn culture. Well, that's just too bad for them, but there's no other way around this.
So, yeah, I definitely think this is an important moment, like as you said, where the mask of the Centauri fell off, and now in someone like Sheridan, every last doubt about the reaction, about the culture, about his personal experience with the Narn definitely changed, because he definitely saw what it was all about. I also think that in looking back, he realizes how many moments where he was just desperate and wanted either Londo or Jakar to just calm down and just talk. He realized that, I would assume that he would realize that that was always pointless because it was always this bloody fight of survival that it was all about from the start.
I think he realizes that, and also that even though through 2 seasons now we saw Londo and Jakar kind of as equals, bickering with each other and pulling their schemes and such, both of them had an empire and a navy not at their disposal, but, standing behind them. Now we see that in reality, there are still certain power dynamics. This isn't a kindergarten where you have two little children fighting it out and it doesn't really matter who started it. Just, break it up and deal with it. This is a situation where it generally does kind of matter who started it, and it does matter who of both of these sides is the one to break the cycle of violence, because one is just definitely in a stronger position than the other. And we talked about this even earlier on. It's now just taken to such an extreme that there's no doubt about that. And I think this is one of the main things that we also see in this meeting, where all of these demands are being cited before the Babylon 5 Council, that looking at all the different alien species in the background, it is made now so apparent and so concrete that a lot of the obtuse bickering that Sheridan and such faced beforehand kind of falls away. There's now a very clear role that the Centauri take on. I mean, to bring this back a little bit to the discussion, you talked a little bit earlier about, why are wars fought? What are the reasons for war? And I think, depending on the context, you will have atheists that talk about, every war is mainly started by some religious extremism. You will have other people that are like, oh no, it's always just about the money. You have other people that say, actually none of this matters. It's a small cabal of elites that sits around somewhere and decides all that, and it's all just a big fake. And I think the reality is, like you say yourself, it's just messier than that. And Babylon 5 does portray this a little bit, because why are the Centauri fighting this war? Well, it really depends on every single character that you look at. Why is Vir fighting this war? Well, he doesn't. He just does not want to fight this war. He's not even in this episode, because, he would never in a million years go along with any of this. This is just terrible to him. And we even hear throughout this episode, it's so important that we finish this war quickly. And obviously this is Reefer bullshitting a lot of the way, but I can easily imagine that a good chunk of the Centauri has no interest in fighting this war whatsoever. And
I mean, we also have to maybe point out that not every war has all of these factors.
Yeah.
There definitely were wars in the past that were about territory, that were about glory, that were about economic interests. And those wars are usually kind of short-lived and definitely, or let me say it this way, they are easier to put to an end at some point. Well, you have also wars that are very ideologically driven by, for example, any kind of fascism on one side, which are very difficult to put to an end and have the tendency to flame up again and again and again.
I mean, these are two very different ideas now.
Okay, because I would go more with there are different kinds. You have some wars that have all of these, you have some wars that have all of these inside and that are messy, but you also can have those that are a bit more simpler and more short-lived.
Okay, so that's interesting, because then you make really a distinction between different kinds of war, essentially, where at least some of these motivations are more dominant than others, or are more existent. That's interesting. I was more going for this idea, at least how I see it here in Babylon 5 portrayed, that every war is gonna have all of these to some extent, where you have a bunch of Centauri who don't want to be in this war at all. You have a bunch of Centauri yammering about the golden days like Londo, and you now feel like, we have no other choice in doing this. You have people like Reefer who just all see it as a big game and don't care, and you have people like the Emperor who is out partying and will just hear about the victory he apparently just had, and that's going to be great for him. But it's interesting, and I think it's true if you say there's definitely some variance in how big of a factor this is in conflicts, at least also in how we write our histories. There are certainly conflicts that are, seen maybe as more of an internal matter if they're, within looking at something like medieval and early modern history, I think you could easily make a very clear distinction how people perceive wars among various European kingdoms that are perceived to be, that's just a kind of all bickering within the same empire. And then you have the serious wars where we are fighting against heathens somewhere in the Holy Land, and that's at least portrayed in a very different light.
I mean, what I was just thinking about was actually the interwar period in Central Europe, which had a lot of little wars that many people don't know much details about, which I also don't know as much about as I would like to. But I have looked at some examples. That was definitely in some examples. I mean, there was not in all of them, but in some it was definitely more like, okay, we want to have this part of them because we want to have this resource, and then under a few months it was quite there, but then it broke out there. And it didn't have this much of an analogical bit. Of course, also always a little, because if you want to have these resources, you think of your nation, and it's kind of patriotic in a way. But it wasn't as brutal. It wasn't complete destruction. It was just like, I want to have this piece of land.
You have those, but especially in the war period, you also have a lot of other communists are coming and kind of gobbling us up. So but I mean, this is the thing, right? Where depending on who you ask, looking at the interwar period is going to be interpreted in very different ways. If we take our not quite unique, but the German perspective, in Germany it was very clear. No, every single war in the interwar period is a matter of survival against the Bolsheviks. Like, we were full on in this. Oh my God. The communists are gonna come and gobble up all of Europe immediately, which was one of the big reasons it's very easy to justify arming up Germany again afterwards. One of the big for the rest of the political spectrum to kind of radicalize itself against that.
Yes, but I mean, in the interwar period, you also have all of these little things going on between everything east of Germany that is not yet Russia. And there, if you go into the details, I think you have a lot of different motivations.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. You have this, but then depending on who you ask, there's going to be very different opinions on that. I think, Poland in the interwar period, I think, has very strong opinions about fighting for its survival rather than some smallish resource shenanigans. All of which is just to say, similar to how we have these very turbulent times with wars that are being fought with very different motivations. We see that things are splintering off like that in the Babylon 5 universe as well. I think it's just opened this door now where, the Non-Centauri War broke out, so the initial mission of Babylon 5 to preserve peace is kind of down the gutter anyway. And now this war is over, but the Centauri have said, we need a bunch of buffer zones, and Earth Alliance already meddled in the Shalasan Civil War to establish what is essentially a bridgehead to maybe have some buffer zones against the conflict parties there. So you can imagine, all of these other small-ish civilizations that are around are going to be much more open to fighting their own wars again as well. So this entire project is in grave danger far beyond just what we've seen so far of one war being fought and being concluded. I think this just opened the door to so much more chaos that is coming out.
Yes, and I mean, also while watching this, all of our main characters are those that are in the picture of the big mystery. I would have to say, like Delenn, for example, and Joel. They all are aware that this is not the big war yet, the great war yet. The great war is here to come, and this was not even close.
Yeah.
And for me, this is also something I always feel throughout this episode. So this is not the big gut punch for me, because this is just for me the moment of thinking, what's next? Because I feel like this is only starting. Like the fire just started, and it's a tragedy, but now it's growing. That's what the is for me.
It's interesting. I get that part. I don't know if that would make it particularly less of a gut punch to me. I mean, this is interesting because if we look at Babylon 5 as a whole and what the plans for it were, there is a version of this story that never got told, where we enter a much more prolonged kind of Cold War-ish phase between the Shadows and the Warlords. And then I think what you describe would have come much more to the forefront, where we would have seen a lot more proxy conflicts, maybe not as big as the Non-Centauri War, but, maybe the Drazi being very expansionist and aggressive and stuff like that, where the war doesn't get hot in a much, much longer time. And it gets into this, like, much more nefarious, it's bubbling up here and there, and everybody knows that things are kind of getting worse, but there isn't this open confrontation that, in this version of Babylon 5 that we are actually heading into, will be a lot more cathartic than that, I think.
Thank God that doesn't sound familiar at all.
Oh, not a lot of this is. But I mean, this is also interesting, and looking at our inevitable real world instances, right? Like, how much do you try to sort these wars into a big picture? Are you looking at this, oh my God, this is the first time that we had a big war in Europe since 1945. How the hell did that happen? Or do you look at it and see, well, we actually, throughout the entire 20th century, the 90s and 2000s, have these wars that, maybe we're a little bit further to Central Asia, so we didn't care about them as much, but it's actually a very consistent line of conflicts that's been going on. And I think in Babylon 5, this is very similar, where we look at this as, this is the big conflict because this is the one we are more invested in with all the characters. But I wonder, like, people like Dylan or the Volons certainly are already much more able to see that there's a much bigger pattern behind this. Like, even if they didn't know about the precise shadow manipulations that might be behind this or not, they understand, there are bigger things at work here than just this particular thing happening to bubble up now.
Yes, and also why I never really want to see this episode as a gut punch episode like that. As you described it, is always because then I always have to think of conversations that I can have with people that are a little bit older than us, that were young in the 90s and that were living in the West, and that are really always putting forward, like my mother, for example, putting forward this thought of we had peace in Europe for so long. And I now wonder how you could have been young or at our age in the 90s and not take notice of anything that happened with then Yugoslavia, like, at all. How that could not have an impact on you at all. So that's why I am always kind of, a bit of skeptical when these things come as a big shock, because I always feel like if you know where to look, you can always see how they burn up. And especially this ignorance towards, for example, Yugoslavia has always been something that bothered me a lot, because I also, as you said, conflicts probably not so much in the focus because they were closer to Central Asia, but I also sometimes think that people are subconsciously selective when it's a culture that is more strange to them, and especially Balkan cultures that have a lot of influence from Ottoman times, that have a lot of Muslim cultures living actively and peacefully for centuries in Europe, are always something that we tend to ignore. If those people die, people in the West are like, it doesn't count, we still have peace. So, yeah, I can get very cynical about that.
I mean, it just depends on, like, how much do you want to punish their generalization by generalizing about people of an entire generation. But, I mean, we know that sometimes the cynicism gets the better of us. That's fair.
There's definitely this tendency in some kind of people.
I mean, it's the whole phenomenon to describe. I mean, the same is like, how do you watch the Soviets go into Afghanistan and fail so horribly and then decide, what we should do? We should just go there and, have a peace mission for a few decades. That's definitely going to work out this time around. It's, we tend to have a very selective memory about what kind of other conflicts matter and why they fail. Moving from kind of the big world politics of Babylon 5, the last big point that I would like to touch on, and I wonder if you have any opinion on it at all, is more character-based. Because obviously for Micah, this is a big change in Jakar, but she has no idea where this character is going to go yet. She doesn't know that he basically becomes Jesus at some point. And this just, like, talking with her about this reminded me of the fact that, I think for me, this is one of the most interesting moments of Jakar, because I love Jakar as the mustache-twirling villain. I love Jakar as the enlightened individual that he is soon to become. But this right now is a glimpse of Jakar that has not been touched by Kosh in any significant way, that has not reached any kind of enlightenment yet, but who also can't have the role of the mustache-twirling villain anymore, who... this is just the guy without any visions, without anything else, who just sort of has to use all of his willpower to ask for sanctuary and to, give his big speech about freedom and do it on his own without any outside help. This is just citizen Jakar without the power that being an ambassador means and without this assurance that having visions of Jakwan gives him later on. it's him kind of in his most vulnerable state, and I find that fascinating.
Hmm. Yeah. But what's the question?
I don't think there is a particular question. For me, I mean, what makes it so interesting for me is, what does this tell me what JMS thinks about this entire character transformation? For example, I like that this proves to us having a religious awakening is not what turns Jakar into a thoughtful individual. It's not like he's this raging, battle-ready lunatic who then has a vision from God and mellows out. It's like, actually, peace is really cool and we need to get this. Like, this is a guy where we know he has a genuine appreciation for the wonders of the universe. He has this entire famous speech with picking up an ant and explaining, the wonders of the first ones. We know he has this side, and this entire poetic prowess that he has is now turned into giving an impassioned speech for freedom, and he has this in him as well. So there are all of these aspects that are going to be so wonderful about him later on. They aren't just randomly activated by him having a vision, and that's something that I really enjoy, and I think something that can be lost if you look at Jakar just from the perspective of having seen the whole show, where I think it very quickly feels like, oh yeah, he's a villain, and then he finds God, and then he's not anymore.
Oh, I never saw it like that, actually.
Okay, yeah.
It has been a while since I've watched all of it, so it's just difficult right now to trace it back in my head, but I never saw it like that.
Mm-hmm.
No, never. Also, I never really saw him as the villain. I think after a few episodes, that kind of stops for me.
Fair.
So I mean, they're introduced as the villains, but then you very quickly get this impression that you were just introduced to this conflict at a random point in time. It's not over. And you grow along with him because he always has this evil kind of humor of a person who survived weird things. So yeah. What I found interesting was that in this moment where, I mean, he maybe also it's important to mention that he doesn't do that all on his own. Like, it's not his own idea to ask for sanctuary. It's what
100%
one from him, and we only see it cut in the way that they ask him to do something, and they tell him that it will be the most toughest thing that they ever ask him to do. And the next thing that you see is him walking into the Sheridan's office. And I wonder if it was meant for us viewers, at least for the first time, to wonder, oh my God, what is he doing now? Because you don't really know what he's on his mind, and it seems so dangerous and so big, and you're like, what the hell is he planning on? And then, like, this dangerous, mysterious, most difficult, big thing ever that he has to do is ask for sanctuary. That's actually an interesting cut, how they cut it all together. But he has no idea what this big thing is, and then it's just like, yeah, hi.
I mean, you say it's just, I mean, I talked about this with Mike a little bit, and this is one of the points where we both thought the performance is particularly great, because like, his walk into his office feels like every fiber in his body is rejecting what he's doing right now. At least to me, this is, what's the toughest thing for Jakar to do? Asking for help. Yeah, that makes sense. That is actually exactly what I imagine. And one of the things that I could not imagine Natos doing in a million years. It's just not something that I see her doing. But it's just asking for help. But for me, this was one of the things I really appreciate about this episode. Like, actually putting a spotlight on the fact that, just go and ask for asylum is not an easy thing to do. You can't do that without abandoning your family back home. You can't do that without, putting your fate into the hands of a commander who, even though you personally might get on with him fine, stands for the Earth Alliance, who just started, befriending the Centauri Republic a whole bunch and such. So it's a very difficult thing.
It's a very difficult thing, but I also think that it kind of makes him take this very special option that a place like Babylon 5 provides, because he gets rid of every title he has. He gets rid of every other official function that he has. And what is he now? He's citizen. Like, citizen becomes a thing, which I always think that if you have these neutral places, if you have the United Nations, if you have something like Babylon 5, it is this great option that they have, that you are there as a human, as a sentient being, as a citizen, and that is an own function. You're not there anymore necessarily as a military officer or whatever else, not even necessarily as a human or as a Narn. You are there under their protection and you are their citizen. I think he becomes something very special in that moment.
I wonder if he actually, now that you say it like this, if he becomes actually the first citizen of Babylon 5. Everybody else is there, as an ambassador, as a trader, as, on behalf of somebody else. He's the first one who has no other home, is just there, which is...
I don't think they make it explicit, but I think if he was there as citizen of Narn, he would still be under the control of Londo, I think.
Yeah.
So he has to be citizen of Babylon 5.
Or at the very least, I don't see the Centauri Republic will always address him as a member of the Kari, because that's their reason for executing him or imprisoning and then executing him. So yeah, it's kind of prophetic, because we know that Babylon 5 eventually does become its own thing, its own little nation and such, so many more people will be able to become citizens of the station. And yeah, early on in this episode, Jakar gets told in the final analysis what you do might be the most important thing, and it is, and not just from the perspective of the Narn. I think in asking for sanctuary, Jakar is also restoring any kind of power that Babylon 5 has. If we look at this final discussion in the council chambers, all Sheridan can do is ask, well, can we send observers to these things? And then Londo says no. And Sheridan can't do anything about that. Sheridan can't impose any kind of sanctions on the Centauri because he doesn't have that authority. He doesn't have that backing from his government. The only thing that Babylon 5 effectively can do, the only thing that stands in the way of Londo having just a power trip, is, Sheridan smugly standing up and saying, oh, actually you can't have him. He asked for sanctuary and I chose to grant it. Which notably is not just a thing that he does under his power, but then also you have Delenn as a member of the Babylon 5 Council backing you up on that. This is the one official function of Babylon 5 that still needles the Centauri, that still holds any weight, and it only exists because Jakar asked for it. And I think, as much as the Narn are out of the picture as a galactic power now, this kind of indicates that at least Jakar as a character still holds this tremendous weight for Babylon 5 as something that will become its own element later on.
So it's interesting from that perspective as well, that even if you have such a place like Babylon 5, the power that you have there is still kind of limited, because you can just have a government who says that we don't recognize this, we don't recognize this. You have that in real life as well. I mean, you have Russia not recognizing the
Geneva Convention. We have a whole bunch of people not recognizing that.
No, I was going for Den Haag and I'm missing the English word once more.
I mean, The Hague.
The Hague. Yeah, not recognizing it. So you definitely have that, and at that point also, in international law, your hands are kind of bound to a certain degree. But also then again, this episode shows us that there's always something that you can do with a sanctuary thing. And I was just wondering, do we have something like that on Earth, like right now? Can I just ask for sanctuary somewhere completely neutral, like at the United Nations? I don't think that's a thing, right?
No, but I mean, you could do the same thing that Jakar does. Like, he asks technically for sanctuary on Babylon 5 as an Earth station. Yeah. So you could do kind of this, and you ask for sanctuary kind of at the UN, and the UN part of that is that multiple nations there would say, well, I back that up, even though technically they don't really have to. It's an odd thing, but that's I think comes mostly from the fact that here in Babylon 5 this is mainly a symbolic act. But it exactly points to the fact that Babylon 5 at this point is only as strong as, the people immediately there choose to make it. It doesn't really have the full support of any of the governments, and it doesn't really have the military prowess to do anything else with that. But I think it's right that we appreciate Babylon 5 putting an emphasis on that for now, because... And I wouldn't even say that as a slight against the show, but I think JMS at some point chooses to go this route that, well, all of this political power that Babylon 5 as a UN can have is great, but it gets to the point where it only really functions if it has military backing. We get to this point where we kind of have to give up on this utopia of saying, oh, there can be this neutral place, and just by enough people recognizing it, it can achieve things. So at some point we just build a big fleet of ships that blow anyone up that speaks up against them, and then you can build something from that. Which I think once we get to the second half of the show, it's going to be an interesting challenge to see how you transition this back into this more idealistic political entity when you get towards the Interstellar Alliance and such.
I wonder if it actually has to be such a big conflict, but we will see that definitely.
It's interesting because, I mean, the last thing maybe we can mention here, we see the fall of Narn. We will see the fall of Centauri Prime as well. Like within the span of the next few years, we will see the Narn take revenge with a bunch of help and such. But this is not the last time that we see Babylon 5 in exactly this position and trying to prevent this. This time, obviously, it horribly failed, and the planet got bombarded to hell and back. Centauri Prime is gonna get bombarded a little bit, but I think at that point, Babylon 5 will have developed to a point where it can deal with this crisis in a lot more functional way. But that's something for the distant future, not something we worry about now. All right. For now, where can people find us?
So you can find us on Twitter, on Mastodon, on Instagram, and on Facebook, where we have our own discussion group. We are Third Age Podcast everywhere. You can also find us on YouTube and anywhere you can find podcasts. But of course, here on YouTube, we are the cutest because here you can see us.
Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to you next week, where, if I remember correctly, we will have a little special prepared, but then we return with regular episodes.